Hello everybody and welcome to video 5 in this Rust programming tutorial series. In this video, I'll be going over collecting user input. Before I do that, I will again mention that I have a course, programmingexpert.io, best place to learn how to code, over 250 practice questions. Actually, now I think it's almost close to 300 practice questions, assessments, projects, all kinds of stuff to interactively learn how to code. Of course, not in Rust, in Go and Python, but great languages to learn. Regardless, if you haven't checked it out yet, please do from the link in the description. Now though, let's get into user input. So the first thing I want to discuss here is that in any of our Rust programs, we have something called a prelude. Now the prelude is essentially a bunch of functionality that's automatically imported and added to our Rust file or Rust code without us having to manually import it. So that's kind of what allows us to use things like print line or FN or different types or a bunch of reserved keywords and functionality from the Rust standard library. So every programming language has a standard library that comes with a bunch of default functionality that you can use, and Rust imports a bunch of that in the prelude for you so you don't have to manually import it. However, if you want to get user input, this is not included in the prelude and you do have to manually import it. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So that's kind of why I wanted to discuss that. Again, the prelude just brings in a bunch of basic functionality that you're almost always going to use. It's kept pretty minimal. And then there's a ton of standard library packages that you can import, and a package in Rust, which is essentially a collection of code, is referred to as a crate. So if you hear me say crate, I'm really referring to a package or a library. They're kind of synonymous. And then within each of those packages or libraries or crates, we have something called a module, which is a specific piece of functionality. For example, here we're going to use the IO module. So what I'm going to do here at the top of my program above this function is write use std, standing for standard library, and then : IO. So what I'm doing is using the std crate or the std package or library, and then I'm bringing in the IO module, which stands for input output, and is going to allow me to get input from the standard input. So if I want to start collecting input here, the first thing I need to do is declare a variable that's mutable that's going to allow me to store my input. So I'm going to say let, and then this is going to be mut. And I'm just going to call this input for now. And this is going to be equal to string with a capital S, : new. Now, what this operator is right here, we've seen it already, is the path separator operator. So it allows us to go from something like a package to a module, and then from something like a module to a specific function or method that's defined inside of there. So here I'm using string, and then I'm grabbing the new function. I'm going to call it a function, I believe that's what it is, which is kind of a constructor and going to create a new empty string object for me. We're going to talk about strings in another video because they're not as straightforward as some other programming languages, say like Python or JavaScript. For now, though, just understand we're creating a mutable string that we'll be able to change later on. Okay, so now that we've created this string, we have a variable where we want to assign our input. We now need to collect the input. So to collect the input, we're going to use IO : and then this is going to be std in. Now, I believe std in stands for standard output in, and the standard output is kind of just like your terminal, right? Whether you're on Mac or Linux or Windows, your terminal or your command prompt is kind of the standard output. So when you're typing in there and we have std in, that's what that's doing. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so we have std in, then we are going to call readline, and we're going to say @mut and then input like this. Now, this is difficult to explain without getting into some much more advanced Rust features. Essentially, what we're doing here is we're actually creating what's known as a mutable reference to this input variable, which is going to allow this function or method, whatever you'd like to call this, to directly modify the data that's stored inside of this variable. Again, I know this is kind of weird, but by default in Rust, when you pass something, say like input, to a function, you're passing actually a copy of whatever the value is here in input. Even though this is mutable, by default, when I put input here, what's going to happen is this function, if you're familiar with what I'm talking about here, is going to create a copy of this value. And that means if it were to say change that copy, it's not going to change the input value here. And that's not helpful to us because we want to grab the input in this variable. So instead, we need to use a reference. Now, a reference is this ampersand. We're gonna get into this in later videos, so don't worry if this is confusing for right now. However, a reference by default is immutable, meaning I can't actually change the reference if I pass this to the function. So instead, I need to say @mut and then input, giving me a mutable reference which I can modify. Essentially, all you really have to understand here is this is allowing us to actually access the input value and change what's being stored here to the input that's typed in the standard input. I know, confusing, but that's what's going on. Okay, so then we need to go here. We need to say expect, and I'm going to say failed to read line. Okay, so let me describe what we just did here. So we grabbed the standard input function from the IO module. We're then using the read line method. That's what I'm going to call this. We are passing a mutable reference to where we want to store the input. And then what this .expect is doing is essentially catching any errors that are going to occur. So what's actually returned here from read line is something known as a result object. I don't want to get into it too much because it's confusing, especially if you're not familiar with these more advanced programming features. But what this requires us to do is to call this .expect on. Now, when we do that, it's just going to check if this gave us a valid value. So if we actually got some input, or if for some reason it couldn't read what we were inserting. That's all it's doing there. So if we couldn't read the line, we are going to say failed to read line. The error is going to be handled, and we'll see this kind of in the terminal. Otherwise, though, we'll just have the value be assigned here to this input variable. All right, so let's just continue here, and then we can go back and look at this more. So now I'm going to say print line, and I'm just going to print out what the user typed in. So I'm going to do my curly braces like that, and then input. Okay, let me make sure I have my semicolons. Let's go here, and let's just go cargo and then run, and let's see what we get. And notice we get hello, comma, world, and then it's giving me my cursor, right? Like it's blinking here, so I can type something like hello, and when I hit enter, hello gets printed out. There you go. So let's run this one more time. We have hello world. My cursor starts going. This means I'm allowed to type something in here. I say hello, what is up? And then it's going to print out exactly what I typed in. Okay, so that is how you get standard input, or that's how you get input from the console. So now that we've done that, let me just remove this expect and show you what happens. So the code actually should execute just fine. However, you will see that we get a warning. So let's run this, and notice now that I get this unused result that must be used. So I'm getting the warning from this line because, as I said, it's returning a result value that we're not using. Now, result is going to contain, as it says here, potentially an error. Now, if it has an error, we need to handle that with the .expect. If it doesn't have an error, then all is good, and again, we get that value assigned to our variable. So in this case, I'm not really going to be causing an error by typing anything in the console, but there is situations in which we can't read the line, and that expect will be triggered. So it does let us actually execute the code, but again, we get that warning. So you want to have this .expect here to handle an error that is returned by result if an error were to occur. Okay, that is really all I need to show you though in terms of standard input. There's not much to go through here. One thing to note is that when we're getting standard input, we're going to be using a string. Let's see what happens if we change this to something like a number, right? Let's change that to like 4. So let's go here and let's clear and let's run. And notice that we get a problem here. It says we expected a string but found an integer. So when we're getting the standard input using read line, we need to have the type here be equal to a string. And that's why I did string : new, because I need to initialize this value first of all, and I just need an empty string so that the type is going to be string, so then we can change this to be the string that the user typed in. All right, with that said, I will leave the video here. I hope this was helpful, showed you how to get user input. In the next video, I believe we're going to look at some arithmetic as well as how we change the types of stuff, and then we'll continue on to some more advanced Rust features. As always, if you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.